news comes first. This is ABC-7 Extra.
Welcome to ABC-7 Extra Sunday edition. Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Ross. With the Democratic runoff elections for Sheriff, District Attorney, and State Representative District 77 just around the corner, in fact, early voting starting tomorrow, we want to give you the opportunity to hear from the candidates before you cast your vote. On this week's show, we'll focus on the candidates for Sheriff and State Representative. Next week, we'll have the two Democratic candidates in the runoff for District Attorney. So tonight, we begin with the race for Sheriff of El Paso County. The two candidates in the runoff are Bobby Flores and Oscar Ugarte. And as you can see, we have only one of the candidates in studio tonight, Bobby Flores. Now, we extended an invitation to Mr. Ugarte, whose campaign sent me this response. Quote, Mark, thank you for the invitation. We are kindly rejecting the request as Oscar is spending his time speaking directly to voters at doors ahead of early voting, unquote. I offered that Mr. Ugarte can reach tens of thousands of homes by coming on this very program, but did not get a response. We also want to point out that Mr. Ugarte also rejected our request to appear in a debate with the other candidates for sheriff ahead of the primary election in March. So we'll spend this portion of the program with candidate Bobby Flores. Mr. Flores, thank you for coming on Extra.
Thank you for the opportunity.
First of all, let's talk about your background in law enforcement. Give us your qualifications and why did you want to become our next sheriff?
So it just seems like the next logical step for me. I came into the agency at the age of 19. I started in the jail, went out to patrol, went to the training academy as a full-time instructor. Then I made sergeant, went to patrol as a sergeant, then investigations to include public corruption investigations, made lieutenant. As a lieutenant, I was assigned back to the training academy as a training director. And then after that, went to undetached duty to the DEA, where we worked highly sensitive long-term narcotics and public corruption investigations. After I finished my college and completed the FBI National Academy, I was promoted to commander, where I went back to the jail annex, ran a $36 million budget back then, and then went to planning and research, put together the body camera system that we have in place. Then back to criminal investigations, where I oversaw officer-involved shootings, murders, sexual assaults, all of our major crimes, and our fugitive task forces and several other sections. And then I was promoted again to assistant chief, back to the jail annex, running a $42 million budget this time and nearly 2,000 inmates. I've worked every aspect of that organization, and I've served that organization proudly. I've given 33 and a half years of my adult life, which is my entire adult life, to serving this community as a law enforcement officer. And I feel like I've still got a ton of gas in the tank, and I want to go back out and continue serving the community. And this just seems like the next logical step.
Now, your opponent, Mr. Ugarte, wants to create a civilian social services unit if he's elected. And of course, that would mean, according to his website, it's a dedicated initiative to addressing pressing social issues in our community, to include mental health, food insecurity, homelessness, helping troubled youth. What is your opinion of this unit, and is it something that the Sheriff's Department needs?
Okay, so anytime you're gonna start a unit, of course you're gonna have to fund it, and we have an over $140 million budget. So if you're gonna start an entire new section, you're gonna pay salaries, you're gonna pay benefits, you're gonna have to pay for vehicles. Now you're looking at the possibility of increasing, or the probability of increasing taxes. Aside from that, you've got social services already in the community. I would be more apt to work with them rather than start our own and create a duplication of efforts. I think that law enforcement needs to focus on public safety. That's what people pay taxes for. Those are the services that people expect from us. And I think that when we deviate from that and we start looking at other ways to spend additional money, I think we're not properly I don't think it's fiscally responsible of taxpayer money for us to be using money in any other capacity other than what benefits public safety.
And would that, of course, if this department was created, wouldn't that require all of the deputies to receive additional training?
Oh, absolutely. Not only the deputies, it'll also be the individuals that are going to be employed. And then you've got a risk factor there. I mean, do you want to be sending social workers into potentially dangerous situations? I'm sure there's going to be some liability there on the part of the county if we go through with something like that. And what's going to happen when somebody does get hurt or maybe even worse, killed. So there are a lot of factors there that I think need to really be considered before we make a promise like that. And I'm focusing strictly on public safety. The community pays taxes for public safety. We need to make sure our jails are back in compliance. We need to make sure that our public safety is adequate for our citizens and our community. And as long as we stay within our mission statement, we're going to be fine.
Let's talk for a minute about Texas Senate Bill 4. You know, of course, that's the one that gives local law enforcement the authority to arrest people who they believe have entered the country illegally. And of course, it's still tied up in a federal appeals court. So what is your position on SB 4? And can the Sheriff's Department actually add that to the list of all of the other things deputies are doing when they're out in the field?
Well, you know, there are a lot of things to look at in SB 4. First of all, we don't know how it's going to come out on the other end once the courts finish up with them. But one of the things that we have to look at is that we do not have the resources to go out and enforce immigration law. That's first and foremost. If we're going to do that, I'm going to need to pull officers from the neighborhoods, from the businesses, doing their security patrols, and move them over to that area. The other thing is that we have to stop and think that if you're going to start arresting people coming across the border, what are you going to do with these kids? Because the kids are also accompanying the adults, right? So if we put a bunch of people in jail, now we've got several kids that we're going to have to force into foster care, or we're going to have to force back into the community. The cost of each individual is about $100 a day to house them. So it will not take long at all for us to maximize our jail capacity, and then we're not going to have any space in the jail to incarcerate those that need to be incarcerated. But on top of that, we have to look at any law from a public safety perspective, and that's how I'm looking at SB 4. Regardless of how it turns out, individuals coming over here, whether they're documented or undocumented, we're looking for people who are violating our laws, people who are posing a threat to public safety, and that's the perspective that I'm looking at.
Now, your website says you want to increase safety in the outlying areas of El Paso County, and that includes Mission del Paso. Is that Lower Valley or Sparks Horizon City? What area is that? And secondly, how you keeping in mind the budget, how do you want to increase that?
Okay, so this is going to have to be a tiered project. Okay, obviously we're not going to be able to just ask for an additional 20 officers to work that area. But to answer your question, it's actually on the east side of El Paso, lower east side. It's south of Horizon City, north of Socorro. Amazon has built there. There are several hundred homes that have gone up there. East Lake has been widened to 6 lanes of traffic from what it was before. And then you've got homes up in the Pelicano, Vista del Sol area. All of that area requires police protection, and we don't have the resources, the proper resources out there to fulfill that. Those people are paying taxes for police protection, and they deserve to get what they pay for. We don't have investigative follow-up there. Our investigative follow-up is being assigned from the Montana area or the Clint area. In short, the organization has failed to grow with the community needs, and I'm looking to fill that gap and fix that. So like I said, it's going to be a tiered process where we can pull officers from other assignments, put them back on patrol because that's where they need to be, and then they can start providing that protection. And then once we get work with Commissioner's Court, I know that Commissioner Holguin has already set aside about 10 acres of land so that we can start putting a station out there. Once we start getting that built up, we can start slowly expanding the criminal investigations and the patrol division to fulfill the needs of that part of the community.
Bobby Flores, Democratic candidate for County Sheriff of El Paso County.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming on ABC-7 Extra.
Thank you very much, sir. It's been an honor.
And the winner of the runoff between Mr. Flores and Oscar Ugarte will face Republican Minerva Torres Shelton in November. When we return on ABC-7 Extra Sunday, we'll speak with Norma Chavez and Vince Pettis, the two Democratic candidates in the runoff for State Representative District 77.
When emergency strikes, go to the trusted name in emergency care, El Paso Emergency Room. Board-certified physicians are on duty 24/7. Faces you can trust. No waiting is our promise. El Pasoans caring for El Pasoans. El Paso Emergency Room. 2 locations east and west.
There are trucks, and then there's the GMC Sierra, available with the connected driving experience and the world's first 6-function multi-pro tailgate. GMC Sierra. It's the truck. Get over $2,700 purchase cash on select 2024 Sierra 1500 Denali models. Plus, current eligible GMC owners get an additional $2,000 purchase allowance.
See your El Paso Las Cruces GMC dealers.
I'm running for sheriff because I love El Paso. I don't need any on-the-job training. I've worked in every division of the sheriff's office, from patrol to administration, special operations, criminal investigations, and overseeing the jail annex. I've been helping keep El Paso safe for more than 33 years. You deserve to feel safe in your homes, in your schools, and on our streets. I will protect the El Paso community like my family. My name is Robert Flores, but you can call me Bobby, and I'm ready to be your next sheriff.
Watch Smart Money Thursday on ABC-7 at 4 with Myro Capital Management. You'll learn how to save money the right way and make better decisions to set you and your family up for financial success. Smart Money Thursday on ABC-7 at 4, sponsored by Myro Capital Management.
1 out of 5 individuals will struggle with a mental illness, and 70% will not seek help. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in individuals between the ages of 10 to 34. The lack of access to care, guilt, shame, and stigma are barriers to mental health care. In spite of all this, we want you to be courageous and not be afraid to ask for help. You are capable and deserving of all the good things in life. El Paso TMS, healing minds and helping hearts.
Welcome back to ABC-7 Extra Sunday. I'm Mark Ross. As we continue with the first of our 2 runoff election previews this week and next, we turn our attention to the race for State Representative District 77, which represents a large portion of El Paso from the west side to the lower valley and part of Socorro. The seat currently held by Lena Ortega, who decided not to run for re-election, and there is no Republican candidate in this race. Joining me now, the Democratic candidates, Norma Chavez, who was a state representative from 1997 to 2009, and Vince Pettis. I'm sorry?
2011.
2011, okay, by a correction there. And Vince Pettis, former county commissioner for Precinct 3 for 8 years beginning in 2013. Ms. Chavez, let's start with you. Why did you decide you wanted to run again for state office?
Well, after sitting out for about 10 years plus, nothing really has changed much in the legislature. In fact, it's gotten worse. There is no debate, dialogue, discussion, compromise in the legislature. It's become very partisan. And as a caregiver of my 91-year-old parents, one of the issues that I'd like to work on in Austin is elder care reform, as well as on veteran issues. As a caregiver, the elderly have many issues with such as the assets test, where people have to sell a car, an extra car, or zero out their savings, or actually sell their homes in order to qualify for services. And I believe that we need to do elder care reform. The other issue that I think is extremely important is taxpayer assistance relief. The Proposition 4 didn't really give much property tax relief.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in just a second.
Right, and that's one of my priorities, because I believe that the CADs need to have reform. The Texas appraisal districts need reform.
And Mr. Pettis, you've stepped away from politics for a little bit. Why have you decided you want to run for office in Austin?
Well, having good leaders in office is really important. Back in 2019, just for example, there was a medical waste company that wanted to locate in El Paso's lower valley, and they wanted to dump 100,000 pounds of medical waste per day. It's something where they got the approval from the state of Texas, and it seemed like a foregone conclusion. We fought back, and it's the first time in Texas history that a medical waste facility was defeated here in Texas. And I think it speaks to the importance of having good advocacy and good leadership, and that's what I'd like to provide for all of House District 77.
Now, I'd like to get both of your opinions on Governor Abbott's school plan, where he wants to have vouchers and other things going on. And of course, the big fight in Austin this last legislative session about that. Mr. Pettis, let's start with you. Where do you stand on the governor's plan here?
Yeah, I think vouchers are a very bad deal for El Paso. and for Texas public schools generally. Right now, 54% of students in Texas public schools are Hispanic or Latino. So the vast majority of students are predominantly minority. That's not the case in private schools. I think the governor's plan for vouchers is a way to further segregate public schools, where you essentially will have two systems. You'll have one for minority students and you'll have another for non-minority students. I think that's the completely wrong approach to fund education. I think ultimately it's going to take away funding from public schools here in El Paso, and the reality is we don't have the private school infrastructure that exists in other parts of Texas. So our kids here really wouldn't have a choice. So it's a bad deal. I ultimately think that those parents who already have kids enrolled in private schools are just going to collect the money, and it's going to become a tax subsidy for the rich. It's a bad deal for Texas, and we need to vehemently oppose it.
And Ms. Chavez, how do you feel about the school choice plan?
Thank you. Well, vouchers is a barracuda in Austin, Texas. That we know that the governor and lieutenant governor have absolutely sent millions of dollars to people who voted against vouchers in the Texas legislature. Many of them lost, and they are now in runoffs. And my opponent is supported heavily by a pro-voucher Legacy 44 group, which is important in this race. I oppose vouchers. I do not think they are good for El Paso. I don't think they're good for the state of Texas to take public dollars away from our public school system and provide them to private schools. Nothing against private schools. I think private schools are great. People that can afford them should pay them. And the school choice issue, you have to have the same standards, and we do not have that. Teachers, you don't even have to have qualified teachers in some of the schools that are trying to get the public vouchers taken away from public schools. So I adamantly oppose that. I also believe that the teachers did not get a pay raise in this last legislative session. They tied a caveat to it, and we need to pay our teachers. That profession is losing teachers. Every day people are retiring, and that profession needs to be brought back to a quality standard that people respect our teaching profession.
Ms. Chavez, should the state be spending billions of dollars on taking care of the border security?
That the border security issue, it's a federal issue. And I think that our local law enforcement, the police, the sheriff, and our first responders, they need to be focusing in neighborhoods, in communities, dealing with domestic violence and issues. I'm endorsed by the Sheriff's Association, the Police Association, also Combined Law Enforcement Association of Texas, as well as the firefighters. And it's because I stand with law enforcement, with law safety, and they have clearly stated that they do not want to be Border Patrol agents. We're not really dealing with solutions. We're throwing money and putting up barbed wires, and we're not dealing with the crisis. What I believe that we need to do, which is a federal issue, again, not a state issue, we should be asking the federal government to provide us with judges, immigration judges along the Texas-Mexico border, so that we can deal with those that qualify for asylum, families. Some of them have sponsors, great, and those elements that could endanger our neighborhoods and our public safety and also our national security. They should not be allowed in the United States. And I do not think that we're doing enough with vetting our borders in El Paso.
Mr. Pettis, your opinion on the border security issue?
Yeah, no, I think the Republicans are going about it completely the wrong way. And unfortunately, it's one of those issues where, they like to talk about the problem, they like to hype up the problem, but they don't really care about solving the problem. Texas taxpayers are spending over $10 billion on this border security issue and Operation Lone Star. There's no accountability. There's no metrics to show exactly what our taxpayers are getting for their money. Is our neighborhoods safer? There hasn't been any data to show that. Has the flow of immigrants and migrants coming through the border slowed down? There's no data to support that either. What they've done with SB 4, where they've criminalized making essentially immigration now a state penalty, what they're essentially doing is making communities like El Paso less safe. What they're going to do is flood our courts, our misdemeanor and our county courts and our felony courts with nonviolent cases that have nothing to do with keeping us safe. By doing that, it's going to postpone and further delay those cases that do pose a safety risk to our community. I mean, as the former county commissioner, I developed an expertise when it comes to our local criminal justice system, and I intend to take that to Austin to tell them, what you're doing is ultimately hurting public safety. It's hurting our neighborhoods, because now cases are going to have to be delayed with all of these other misdemeanor and felony immigration cases that are nonviolent. For individuals that do pose a risk, to our community safety, those are the folks that we should be dealing with. But making this a state crime, it's just completely the wrong way to go about it.
And still ahead, we'll continue our discussion with the Democratic candidates for State Representative District 77, Norma Chavez and Vince Pettis. You're watching ABC-7 Extra Sunday Edition.
For everyone who's endured the bad seat, finally, sweet, sweet redemption. The Lexus TX, 3-row luxury that treats every seat like the best seat.
Get $750 lease cash toward a 2024 TX 350.
Hello, my name is Dr. Carlos Viesca with Border Pain Institute, and I would like to introduce you to the new FDA-approved XTRA procedure, which is 90 to 95% successful in treating low back pain. This revolutionary procedure is minimally invasive with a very short recovery time that will help you regain functionality and get you back to the normal activities that bring joy to your life. If you or someone you know is suffering from chronic pain, give us a call to discuss your options.
On August 3rd, 2019, our community was attacked by hate. But almost 5 years later, we've yet to receive the justice or closure that we deserve because of the failures of our last district attorney. As a former prosecutor working on the case, I could have never imagined that we would still be here so many years later. That's why I'm running for district attorney now, to get back to the office to finish the job. I will not let you down.
There's DNA. Then there's heavy-duty DNA. HDNA. It's engineered into every aspect of the GMC Sierra HD. With the pulling power to prove it. Tow hitches of the world, prepare for glory.
New 2024 Sierra heavy-duty models arriving weekly. Stop by your GMC dealer to make your selection. See your El Paso Las Cruces GMC dealers.
And welcome back to ABC-7 Extra Sunday. I'm Mark Ross. We return with the two Democratic candidates in the runoff for State Representative District 77, Norma Chavez and Vince Pettis. You touched on this briefly, Ms. Chavez, in the last segment. Homeowners are getting a tax break thanks to Proposition 4, but what other tax breaks can you work on if you're elected to go back to Austin?
Well, they didn't really get much of a tax break. Proposition 4 failed because what we have is a problem with the CADs. EPCAD, El Paso County Appraisal District, has the power to raise the valuations of taxation, and they have an unlimited amount of power. They allowed for 3 elected officials to serve on the board, and unfortunately nobody ran for those positions. I don't think it was well advertised, but we do need some, I believe, CAD reform. That's a priority issue that the governor is going to take to the Texas legislature, and it's an issue that's extremely important to me. The elderly, the disabled, and veterans need some special consideration. They don't have children in public schools anymore. They should have those taxes frozen until they sell their home, and so I would be working as a senior member. I go in as a 14-year member in an 8th term. I do retain my seniority, and I would be able to have the opportunity to serve on the committees that make those decisions, because I won't be a freshman coming in, with training wheels.
Okay. Mr. Pettis, your thoughts on more tax relief for El Pasoans?
Yeah, property tax reform is really important, but I mean, I hope that my opponent's answer demonstrates. We've been campaigning now for 8 months. She was first elected 28 years ago, and she still doesn't have any specific proposal on when it comes to property tax reform. When she was in the legislature, again, she was elected 28 years ago, she never authored a single bill on property tax relief. I brought her extensive record here, so we can vet it before Sunday, before this airs. But she likes to talk a lot about property taxes and likes to talk a lot about the problem, but offers no solutions about what to do. But here's exactly what I would do. The border communities in Texas have higher tax rates than non-border communities because we are property poor. It's fundamentally unfair that border residents have to pay more for state services, like the public hospital. We have to provide health care for those who can't afford it, who come through our hospital doors. We have to provide public defense whenever somebody's convicted of a crime and they can't afford an attorney. They have to go through the courts, whether it be a misdemeanor court or a felony court. But these are all state services that are paid for with local tax dollars. Well, how is it fair that we come from a property poor area that we have to ultimately tax our residents sometimes 25, 30, 35% more to just generate enough revenue to provide the basic level of service, while places like Houston, Austin, and Dallas can offer a lower tax rate but generate more revenue? So I would author legislation that would require local governments to report how much are they spending on these state-mandated services. Once we get an idea statewide that, hey, you know what, the people in El Paso are paying 25% more for their public hospital, they're paying 25% more for public defense, then we can start talking about solutions about how we equalize that. But those are the specific policy proposals that need to be talked about that my opponent never talked about in her whole time in the legislature, nor has she talked about during the last 8 months.
Well, Mr. Pettis, while you were county commissioner, you voted to approve a comprehensive mobility plan that provided $400 million for transportation infrastructure in the county. If you're elected as a state representative, what would you do to bring in more state money for infrastructure for our highways?
El Paso, again, when we talk about equity, when we look at the amount of funding that TxDOT spends to border communities relative to non-border communities, we are shortchanged. We do not get the same amount of funding that cities that have less population than El Paso receive. When I was county commissioner, and then I was chairman of the MPO, which oversaw all the federal funding that came into El Paso, we required all entities to work collaboratively, and the county came up with its first transportation plan in its history. There was a funding source that was identified, and that enabled us to leverage local tax dollars with more federal dollars, and that's how we were able to do a lot of these transportation projects. But there's a lot of discretionary funding where the Department of Transportation has the ability to say, hey, you know what, this year we're going to give an extra $1 billion to a certain community. Well, it just happens that those communities typically is in El Paso. It's going to these other metropolitan areas, and it's fundamentally not fair. So I would look at legislation that would possibly, make sure that this discretionary funding is more equally distributed, because we absolutely need better transportation infrastructure here in El Paso.
And Ms. Chavez, what would you do to improve transportation and mobility here in El Paso County?
Great. Well, first of all, I would like to say that respond to Vince quickly on what he said, which is, first of all, we didn't have the property tax problems that we have today that we had back then. So no, I did not file any property tax bills in the 14 years that I served there. But regarding transportation, I think it's extremely important. And the other thing is, I didn't go to Austin to increase my salary. I didn't give myself a pay raise 5 times. And so there's some fundamental differences in leadership, as he states, between the two of us. Transportation is an important issue. We are the second largest port of entry in the state of Texas. Behind Laredo is #1, and our arteries are bursting with 18-wheelers. The traffic is extremely bad. And you've got to have someone that knows how to work in the legislature, work with others, not pontificate and think that they're the smartest person in the room, but knows how to sit down and work with Republicans and Democrats. I have a record of being able to do that. I was also criticized by my Democratic Party for working with Republicans, and I will do what I need to do for El Paso. You sit at the table, and we have to deal with I would say expanding our 18-wheeler transportation arteries to go to the Tornillo Bridge, which is not utilized, and also the New Mexico Santa Teresa Bridge. And also, of course, we have the main artery that goes up through 54, which is extremely important. So these are public conversations I've met with, and I have the support of people like Stanley Job, Maria Teran, people that are deeply involved in transportation that I believe are important for us to acknowledge and recognize that we have to do better. The other thing that's important on transportation, and is an issue that I worked on at the federal level and the state level, and that is air quality. When a community is non-attainment, you cannot recruit the corporations and companies like what we have been able to bring to El Paso until we are in attainment. Right now, as a result of all the pollution, the pollution from the 18-wheelers from Mexico, I don't know if they're doing emission testing anymore. We are a non-attainment air quality community, and I would utilize all my experience in that to work with both the Mexico side and El Paso and Texas and New Mexico for air quality issues, which include a very comprehensive plan with transportation.
Final question for both of you, and Ms. Chavez, I'll start with you. You know, you've talked about being able to work across the aisle. We're dealing now with a much heavier Republican-led legislature in Austin. As a Democrat, what are the challenges that you would face going back to Austin and trying to work across the aisle with many of these legislators who are very conservative on some issues?
Yes, fortunately I have many former colleagues, both Republican and Democratic, that are still serving in the legislature, and some of them from the House are now in the Senate. Those relationships are where I start as a leader. You go to the people that you know first. Also, you end up with the working with again, crossing the aisle and working with others to sit there and say, we need to develop relationships that are good for Texas. And I think that the people are tired of this partisanship bickering at the state level as well as at the federal level. I have that experience. Again, I go in with seniority. I'll be in the top 30 out of 140 members. I have passed 140 bills as appropriation riders, as including the money for the medical school, as amendments, as constitutional amendments. Those things you don't learn in one session. Those are experiences, legislative experience, institutional knowledge that I bring to the table for El Paso. I'm ready to serve. I'm ready to be a community-based leader for El Paso, and I ask the people to support me. Norma Chavez for State Representative. And if you have questions, please call me. My phone number and information is on my website, normaforelpaso.com.
And Mr. Pettis, we'll give you the final word here. How would you work with a conservative Republican legislature and try and get things done for El Pasoans?
Sure. Well, first, in responding to Ms. Chavez, look, in the period from 2002 to 2012, that 10 years, there were 32 public elected officials here in El Paso who were arrested on public corruption, bribery, fraud, embezzlement. A lot of that took place. The county was not immune from that. My predecessor, who I defeated in 2012, was arrested on federal drug trafficking charges. I say this because the county commissioners was viewed as a part-time position that nobody took seriously. The people's problems that they have are not, part-time. These are full-time problems that need serious policy professionals behind them. Ms. Chavez loves to talk about this talking point. But when this ethics scandal was happening, and somebody tried to do something about it in Austin, her colleague authored the first ethics bill here in El Paso. She tried to kill it.
No, I made it better.
Okay. And I think that says a lot, because when you look at the results of the election in March, 50% of the constituents that I served voted for me. And I think that says a lot. When you look at Ms. Chavez's former constituents in her area from Jefferson to Isleta, 66% of the voters voted against her. 60% of her own neighbors in her home precinct near Clardy voted against her. What does that say when your former constituents who you've served for 14 years don't vote for you? I think that says a lot. But
I'm pretty happy to have a lot of people voting for me on the west side, the central side, the new areas.
Because they don't know you and you're trying to reinvent yourself.
I'm going to have to wrap things up right there. I want to thank both Norma Chavez and Vince Pettis, the Democratic runoff candidates for State Representative District 77.
Thank you
so
both
much for coming on ABC-7 Extra.
Thank you.
And remember that early voting for the runoffs begins tomorrow. Election day is Tuesday, May 28th. Thanks for watching ABC-7 Extra Sunday. I'm Mark Ross. Stay safe, stay strong. I'll see you next Sunday night with the Democratic candidates in the runoff for El Paso District Attorney.
Thank you for watching. ABC-7 News is now available on any of these streaming